All right, welcome to the next session of our Bible study, which is Judges, and it's chapters 1 through 16. And let's start with a little prayer. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. We ask you, Lord, to be with us tonight as you are always with us, and to open our hearts to your word and help us see what to make of the book of Judges. We love you, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so let me share screen and let's get this baby started. So Judges chapter 1 through 16. And we are going to start, as always, with our review. So we've got creation, fall, flood, nations, Adam and Eve, original sin, Noah, and the Tower of Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Abraham called out of Ur, tested his faith by God asking him to sacrifice Isaac, but then holding back his hand. He passed the test. Jacob, who usurped Esau and had his name changed to Israel and had 12 sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph, his 11th son, who got sold into Egypt. Redemption, revelation. So there's a big famine in the country, and all the rest of Jacob's sons, except Benjamin, go down to Egypt to get food for the family. Eventually, Joseph reveals himself as their brother that they sold, and there's a great reunion, and they send him back to get his father, Jacob. And so when Jacob hears about it, he sacrifices to Yahweh, and then he heads into Egypt, and they are kept separate from the rest of the Egyptians. So that's the sanctification part. That's the keeping separate. The tribes flourish in Egypt, but then after a few generations, the Pharaoh forgets them. He forgets who Joseph was, and he decides that those people that are in here that are foreigners, they're getting too strong, and they're going to have to be put into slavery. And so that's what he does to subdue them. So they transition from being a free people who are thriving to brickmakers who are not thriving, who are miserable. So then we have the coverage. The coverage is the 400 years of slavery in Egypt, and it ends with a woman taking her little baby, Moses, and putting him into the river, and he gets drawn out of the Nile by the Pharaoh's daughter. And he's raised as an Egyptian, but realizes he is a Hebrew. He kills an Egyptian. He runs away to Midian. He's happy there being a shepherd, but he sees a burning bush, and the burning bush tells him that he is the God that is. I am who I am. And he tells them to go get his people out of Egypt. And so Moses does that. He follows that commandment. The Red Sea parts, Israel leaves. The Egyptian army is drowned in the waters that don't part anymore. And the Israelites head to Mount Sinai, and God gives them a covenant. He says, "You will be my people, and I will be your God, and here are the commandments you'll follow." And so he makes a covenant with them. And so now the covenant has gone from one holy couple to one holy family with Noah to one holy nation with Israel. So they have to wander in the desert for 40 years because ultimately 12 spies go into the chosen land to spy it out. But 10 of them come back and say the people are too powerful. We just can't do it. Oops, I'm going to go to the waiting room here and let in Sherry and Kathy. and they're joining us right now. So I will mute everybody once I see Kathy's in. All right, everybody's here, everybody's muted, and I will just keep going. Oh, except I did the wrong thing. All right, get rid of this. There we go, now we're back. So they wander for 40 years in the desert. Then the conquest happens where they go and they, in the book of Joshua, we read how Joshua and the Israelites conquer the chosen land and how it's divided among the 12 tribes. And that's the settlement part. So it's creation, fall, flood, nations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, redemption, revelation, sacrifice, sanctification, tribes, tragedy, transition, coverage, commands, covenant, conquest, settlement. And the next word that you're going to have next week is cycles, because that's what we're going to study in Judges. So we have to make sense of the book of Judges. The book of Judges, what it does is it gathers the heroic stories between Joshua and the building of the temple, which happens under King Solomon. And what happens is, here you got this land. It's got 12 tribes in it. They're not united during the time of the Judges. They conquer, but they split up. They're all over this territory. And they're basically living as separate tribes. They remember their brothers and they worship Yahweh, sort of, in their own broken ways. But when it finally happens, when David finally unites all these 12 tribes into one nation, now they want to write down the history of what happened between the Exodus and when they actually become united. And that's what the book of Judges tells the story of, that time. And so it's written and collected after everything happens. And it's put into a sequence that essentially makes it look like it's all happening one on top of the other. But it's not. It's a work of major judges and minor judges. And the biggest difference between the major judges and the minor judges are the major judges are hero liberators, right? They have a special charism from God. And when Israel comes under, or when their tribe comes under domination by some people, then God raises up this hero, this judge, and he liberates them. And so 6 of the judges have stories that go with them. They're hero liberators. And those stories were passed down orally through these tribes of their great heroes who saved their people. Well, when they wrote down the stories, instead of talking about them just as a tribe, they talked about them as the judge of Israel, as though they were the judge of all 12 tribes. But of course, the tribes weren't united yet. But that's what the editors did as they wrote down this history. So the major judges, the major liberator heroes that we have are Othniel, who was from Judah. You'll see that a lot of the tribes are represented by these judges. Ehud, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. Deborah, probably from Ephraim, since that's where she was judging from. Gideon was from Manasseh. Jephthah was also from Manasseh. Samson was from the tribe of Dan. And then we have the minor judges. Shamgar, there's a lot of controversy over Shamgar, whether he was even an Israelite. Some Jewish scholars will say that he was actually a Hittite, which was not an Israelite at all. But we don't really know what tribe he was from, if he was an Israelite. Tola, who was one of the minor judges. Now, all the minor judges, the only thing that happens is their names are mentioned, and the years that they served as judge. So Tola was from the tribe of Issachar, Jer from Manasseh, Ibzan was either from Judah or Zebulun, Elon was from Zebulun, Abdon was from the tribe of Ephraim. So we see there's these large distribution among the tribes. And the other interesting thing is with the major judges who have these big stories that go with them, you'll see that the number of years is like 20 or 40, 80, all kind of in there around that 40 mark, either half of it or twice of it that they ruled. And the minor judges actually have kind of realistic numbers that go with their judging, 33 years or 18 years, you know. Well, if you take all the years and add them up that are in the Bible between when Exodus occurred, kind of from the end of Joshua all the way up to the building of the temple. In the Deuteronomic history, it's about 480 years. And so what they did is they wrote the book of Judges as they thought, why don't we take these years and if you add everything up, we'll come up with about the 480. But the actual century of the judges, it was actually about a century and a half that there were judges ruling in Israel. But this is the gathering of their stories that we read about. Now, one of the hard parts of the Bible is, well, we talk about they're always fighting with the Canaanites, and we have to remember who Canaan was, right? Here's this picture we had before. Here's Noah. The flood ends. He gets a little carried away, drinks too much wine, gets drunk. His son Ham finds him and laughs at him, and his other two sons don't. They look away and they cover him up. And when Noah finds out about it, Ham laughing at him, he curses his son. So it would have been Noah's grandson, Canaan, and he gets cursed by Noah, and he becomes the father of the Canaanite tribes. So instead of just calling them, sometimes they just call them Canaanites, but other times they'll call them Sidonians, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvarites, Zemarites, Hamathites, right? All of these are Canaanite tribes. And then thrown into the book of Judges, you'll see other people. You'll see the Ammonites, who are not Canaanites, but another people, Philistines, also enemies of Judah or of Israel, but they're not Canaanites. Moab is another one. All right. So, but all of these would be Canaanites, and it makes it kind of confusing as you're reading. But let's get to chapter 1 of Judges. Chapters 1 and 2 are kind of an introduction to those major and minor judges that we talked about. And it's chapter 1 is kind of told from the viewpoint of Judah and Simeon. And they talk about, first of all, the great role that they played in conquering land. We always like to brag about ourselves first. And then they talk about the incomplete conquest, right? God told them to put all the people out of the chosen land, because it's not that God hated all the other people, but he knew what would happen if they mixed with other people, which is they would start worshiping some God other than him. Well, so Judah and Simeon first talk about how they take Jerusalem and Hebron and Gaza, but they can't take the plains. They can only take the hills, that there are still enemy tribes who have steel-wheeled chariots that are in the plains, and they're too strong to conquer, so they can only take the hill country. They do, though, conquer one of the Canaanite kings, and they talk about as it makes everybody kind of queasy, how they cut off his big toes and his thumbs of the ex-king uh, after they captured him. But then you can again see the barbarous type of environment that they lived in, because this king is kind of, he reflects on it and he says, I had over 70 kings without thumbs or toes who waited on me, right? He did the same thing to his enemies. Again, it was the culture back then. The other part of the culture that makes us queasy is that Caleb gives his younger brother his daughter, Caleb's daughter, for a wife. So that would be his niece, gets given to him for his wife. Um, the rules of incest did not come into play until later in the Bible. So you'll see that in the Old Testament. And Caleb did that because he said, whoever can go and take this enemy, if he takes him, I'll give him my daughter for a wife. And it happened to be his younger brother who won the battle. We also hear about Moses' father-in-law's people settling in the wilderness of Judah, right? Jethro, who had several different names. He was Moses' father-in-law. He was actually from Midian, but he was a Canaanite from Midian. And so we hear how he settles in this wilderness of Judah, and his people do. I shouldn't say he does. He has long ago passed away. But then we hear about the other tribes. We hear about Benjamin, and Benjamin allows Jebusites in Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem would lay right in here, and they weren't able to kick everybody out, or they chose not to kick everybody out. And then we hear similar things about the other tribes, at least of Ephraim and Manasseh. I put them in parentheses just to remind you, these are Joseph's two sons, and it was their tribes that were given land in the chosen land. There's Ephraim and Manasseh right there on our map. Zebulon, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, all of them we hear in chapter 1 didn't kick all the foreigners out of their land. Instead, what they did was they used them for forced labor. So they basically made them into slaves, not doing what God said to do. But in chapters 2 and 3, we see that Israel pays a price for disobedience. And God says that he's not going to drive out all of Israel's adversaries because they've not done what he's told them to. So he's going to leave them as a test for Israel's faithfulness, so that Israel might, all the generations might know war, right? They'll know what it's like to have your enemies living near you. And so he does take pity on them, as we'll see many times over. But Israel is doing this cyclic thing where they do what's evil in the Lord's sight. And in chapter 2, it tells us that they serve the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Well, the Baals and the Ashtaroth, Baal is a name that's kind of given to foreign gods in general. Sometimes it refers as though it's a god himself. Sometimes it's referring, like the Baal of the Ammonites might be Dagon, right? That's the name of the god. Baal is just kind of like an overriding name for foreign gods. So Baal will be used for false gods like Dagon, Hadad, Adad, Marduk, Chemosh. And then we've got the female gods. Over here, we've got the statue of Astarte with a horned headdress. That's a pretty nasty looking goddess right there. She was a goddess of fertility. Ishtar is another female goddess. Asherah is yet another one. And it ticks off Yahweh that they are serving all these other gods, that they're worshiping gods other than him. They're breaking his covenant. And they're intermarrying with the foreigners. We hear that many a time. So God allows them to be plundered, but then he takes pity on them and he raises up a judge to save them. And you can see that chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3 are introductory chapters and that they're written in a later time because it's like an introduction to the book of Judges. It actually tells you that this is the cycle they go through and that this is how God saves them by raising up these different judges. And then it starts in with the particular judges. So the first judge of Israel is Othniel. And God allows the king of Mesopotamia to put Israel into servitude for 8 years because they did what was evil in his sight. They worshiped foreign gods. And so they're in servitude for 8 years. And then the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Othniel. That's what we always hear about the major judges. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon them. They get this special charism so that they can liberate his people again, because he's got a plan, right? He's making a hole in all these barbarians for this people who can finally understand who Jesus Christ is. And so to make that plan happen, he's got to liberate them. So it comes upon Othniel, Caleb's younger brother, and Israel is freed from Mesopotamia, and it has rest for 40 years, right? One of those, remember the year 40 kind of is like a transition number. It's a big change that comes about. Well, so after 40 years, Israel does what's evil in the sight of the Lord. And now he makes them serve Moab for 18 years. And then he raises up his second judge, Ehud. I get kind of a kick out of it that you know, it will mention several times in the Old Testament that people are left-handed, and left-handed people tend to be great warriors. And so he's a Benjaminite, and he kills a very fat king. And we get kind of a graphic details of how he straps the knife to his thigh, and then he gets all the servants to leave the king, and then he buries the hilt of his knife all the way through the fat of the king. Then he drags him into the latrine and closes the door. And so then when the servants do peek in, they're like, oh, he's in the bathroom. And they kind of wonder why he's in there for so long. In the meantime, Ehud slips away. And so when they finally find him, they're disheartened. Ehud raises up an army and they're freed from Moab. And now the land has rest for 80 years. And then it mentions just the minor judges in passing. Shamgar, the third judge, he's the one we said may or may not have been an Israelite. He killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That's all we know about him. And then in chapters 4 and 5, we get the only female judge of Israel that's mentioned, and that's Deborah. And so Deborah, who is a prophetess, judges Israel. Again, Israel has done evil, and God sells them into the hand of Jabin, who's the king of Canaan. And the commander of his army is named Sisera. And he raises up Deborah, this judge, and she sits under the palm, and people come to her. She rules the country, and she is also the one who kind of settles things between people. And God talks to her, and he tells her to call Barak, the head of the army, and tell him to take his men to Mount Tabor, because he's going to deliver Canaan into Israel's hands. He's going to finally free them after all these years. And Mount Tabor is kind of a cool place to send them. It's going to be on Mount Tabor that Christ has his transfiguration, where three of his disciples, Peter, John, and James, get to see him in his glory talking to Moses and to Elijah. And so that's going to happen in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, it's where Barak is to take his army. Well, and Barak says to Deborah, yeah, okay, I'll do this, but only if you go with us. And so Deborah says, I'll go with you, but because you're such a chicken, God is not going to deliver Sisera, the head of the Canaanite army, into your hands. He's going to be killed by a woman, just to show you what a woman you are for not going without me. And so Barak goes and he does rout the enemy's army. But just as Deborah prophesied, when Sisera sees that his army is being routed, he runs away, and he runs away to Heber, the Canaanite, right? The Canaanites, those are Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, that's his people. Well, they're basically not fighting with the Canaanites. They at least have some kind of peace treaty with them. And so Sisera feels like he's going to be safe with the Canaanites. Well, he gets there, and Jael, Heber's wife, meets him at the tent door. And she's like, oh, come on in, Sisera. He's like, oh, I'm thirsty. And so she gets him some milk and curds, and she tucks him into bed. And then, as you can see in this mosaic, she pulls out a mallet and a tent stake, and she drives it through his head, and she kills him. And so Israel is freed from Canaan, and the land has rest for 40 years. This mosaic, a very beautiful picture, and I included it when I went to the Holy Land. I went with my scripture teacher, Dr. David Twellman, and he was a photographer in the Navy, and he took some beautiful pictures while we were there. And this is one of them. And I'll show you where it came from, because it's kind of a neat thing about women in the Bible. In chapter 5, chapter 4 is the story, and then chapter 5 retells the story, but it retells it in song. And one of the interesting things about chapter 5 is that is one of the oldest parts of the Old Testament. From the Hebrew itself, from the song, they know that it's very ancient, probably dates back to the 12th century before Christ. And that is when Deborah would have reigned. And that song was sung by the people. That's how they remembered their heroes, right? So they remembered Deborah and Jael and Sisera and, Sisera's mother who's waiting for him because she thinks he's going to bring her some spoils. But of course, he's not going to, because he's been killed. So anyway, that picture of Jael is right there. And it's this mosaic of great women of the Old Testament. And its tops our Blessed Mother in her Dormition. There's a church there called the Church of the Dormition in Jerusalem. And this is a beautiful wooden carving of the Blessed Mother. And the belief is that she was offered whether she would die or just go to sleep and be raised into heaven. And she chose dormition. She chose to sleep, and that her son, Jesus, right? She can't ascend into heaven like he did. She's not a God. She's a human being. So above her in this canopy is this mosaic. And there's her son who's going to lift her up into heaven. And right here is Eve, the first mother of all of humanity, with the snake behind her and the apple in her hand. Here's Miriam with her tambourine, Moses' sister. Here's Jael with her tent stake. Right here, you've got Judith, and she's holding the head of Holofernes, who's an enemy general who she kills. if you guys read the book of Ruth, because I gave that to you as one of your optional readings, real short and beautiful story. Here she is with wheat from the threshing floor, right? She ends up marrying Boaz and being in the genealogy of Jesus. This is Esther, Queen Esther, right here, who again saves Israel from their enemies. And so this is really beautiful. It's breathtaking, as is this particular entire church. And those books of the Bible, Edith or Esther and Judith, if you have time to read them, they're great reading and they're easy to read. Again, they're kind of violent, as is most of the Old Testament. So on to chapter 6 of Judges. Gideon is made a judge after Deborah. Again, Israel has done what's evil in God's eyes, and they've been worshiping the Ammonite or Amorite gods. Gideon is from the weakest of the clans of Manasseh. So when God decides to raise him up as a judge, Gideon is a little squeamish about it, right? He's like, you're talking to somebody who's from the weakest clan of Manasseh, and I'm the weakest person in that clan. You really want me as a judge? And so he says to the angel of the Lord, I just need a sign that this is really what you want, because what the angel of the Lord is telling him to do is to go to his own father's house, right? His father even is worshiping Baal, and he has an Asherah pole. Now, Asherah was the goddess of motherhood, basically, and her statues were usually made out of trees. Sometimes they were very, very large. This happens to be an Asherah pole that's in a museum. But oftentimes they were carved of wood and they were very large. And one of the interesting things when they go into these old Israeli archaeological dig sites of the very ancient tribes of this time period, right around the 12th century BC, which would have been the 1100s, right in there, they will find in the kitchens all sorts of figurines of female gods that they were worshiping. And so, at any rate, let me shut this off if I can. All right. So Gideon is told to go and tear down this altar and to sacrifice a bull and to tear down the Asherah pole and use it as its wood to burn this burnt offering. But Gideon first says, I need a sign. And so the angel of the Lord said, okay, kill a kid, make some cakes, pour the broth over it on this rock. And then the angel of the Lord touches his staff to it. It all goes up in flame, and Gideon believes, at least for a little while. So he goes and he actually tears down the altar. He uses the Asherah pole for the wood. He does the burnt offering, and the tribe is furious. And they're like, who did this? And they go to his father and they want Gideon, but his father will not give him up. And so Joash stands up for his son and he calls him Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend against him. If he is guilty, right, let this other God. All of a sudden, Joash remembers, oh, right, I'm supposed to be worshiping Yahweh. I better defend my son. And so he gives him this name, Jerubbaal. And the Spirit of the Lord comes on him. And Jerubbaal, or Gideon, raises up an army. And then before he takes his army out to fight anybody, he asks for 2 more signs. again, that's, right? We don't always believe that God is calling us. And so he's like, I got this fleece of a lamb. What I would like you to do, God, is make it wet with dew, but don't make the rest of the ground wet, just the fleece. So God does it. He squeezes that fleece, he gets out a whole bowl full of water, and he says, oh, but don't be mad at me, but now reverse it. Make the fleece dry, the ground wet. And so God does it for him. I guess because he knew that Gideon was a weak man. And even in this, I love the medal of Gideon. He kind of looks like a nerd in this medal that was done of him. Uh, of course, this was done by somebody centuries later, but even he read into Gideon that he was not much of a fighter. So Gideon raises up this army, but God says, it's way too big. If you use this big, huge army, then everybody's going to think that you, Israel, did it on your own. So, first of all, just send away anybody who's afraid. So Gideon says, if you're afraid, if you're trembling, hit the road. So a bunch of guys leave, but the army's still too big. So God says, take them down to the river and have them drink. And whoever laps like a dog, keep. And whoever doesn't, then okay, don't, just send them on home. We don't want them. So all these men go down, and if you kind of read, scholars are always debating, what does this mean to lap like a dog? Because then we hear that they get water in their hands, and the idea is, if you crouch down but you keep your head up and you use your hands to bring the water to your mouth and you lap it like this, then you can always keep your eye on the enemy. But if you get on your hands and knees and you suck water out of the river, then your eyes are down. You're not really a very good soldier because somebody could pop you on the back of the head. So this was kind of a way of showing who is a good soldier and who is not. So 300 are selected by lapping water like dogs. And so he's got this army now, and he's come and he's near the enemy. And God says, Gideon, go on down to the enemy's camp and you'll hear something you want to hear. And he says, but if you're afraid to go alone, take your servant with you. So of course Gideon takes his servant, because Gideon's always kind of a little bit jumpy. And they go down and they hear the enemy talking about a dream. This guy is relating to his comrade that he had this dream of a cake of barley bread, squishing a tent and flipping it over. And when he relates this dream, his comrade says, that's the sword of Gideon. They're going to win. And Gideon, when he hears this vision, he realizes the same thing. Man, these people are scared, and they're scared because God is going to give their army over to us. So he goes back, he tells his 300 men, divide into 3 sections. And I want each of you to get a trumpet, and here's a jar, and here's a torch. And you wait until you get my signal, then blow your horns, and then drop your jar, right, which would make a lot of noise, and it probably really threw, since it's at night and you just set a new watch, so they're jumpy anyway. You get this raucous horns blowing, jars coming down, you see torches, and the army runs. And they're all shouting for the Lord and Gideon. So the enemy's routed, and they get 2 of the princes, Oreb and Zeb, and they behead them, in keeping with the tradition of the Old Testament's gross killings. So then Gideon pursues Midian's kings, and the tribe of Ephraim is ticked because he only took 300 with him. And now he's had this big rout, he's had this huge victory, but they didn't take them with him, and they're mad. But he kind of says to him, geez, look what you've got, and I'm still like the bottom of the the barrel. He appeases them. He makes them happy. He puts them at rest. But then he goes to pursue Midian's kings with his 300 men, and he gets to two different towns, Sukkoth and Penuel, and he says, my men are faint, they haven't had food, they need it, give it to them. And they're like, you don't have Midian's kings yet. Are you kidding us? They're gonna, and what they're thinking is, right, those kings are gonna turn around, get their big huge army back together and come and squish your 300 faint men. We're not giving you a thing. And Midian tells them, or Gideon tells them, you're going to pay for this once I get those kings. So he goes and he catches the two kings, Zeba and Zalmunna, and he returns to Sukkoth and Penuel, and he does punish them, and he kills them and uses thorns and brambles to torture them. And then he kills the kings. And actually, he tells his son to kill the king, but his younger son won't. He's too young to be able to do that. So Gideon does it himself. Well, now all the people are like, Gideon, you are awesome, right? You're a great warrior. You become our king, and your sons, right? We'll just make this a kingship where it's passed down. And Gideon says, no, I'm not going to become a king. You've got a king. Yahweh is your king, right? This is a lesson that Israel just cannot get, that Yahweh is their king, not men. And so he refuses, but he makes a golden ephod, which becomes the snare of Israel, right? Because he's not going to become a king, but now he's made something that they can worship, just like a golden calf. Now it's a golden ephod. And Gideon still refuses to become a king, but he does have 70 sons by many wives. And he has a concubine that's mentioned who lives in Shechem, and she also has a son, and his name is Abimelech. Now, Gideon dies after 40 years, and Israel plays the harlot and mistreats his family, his 70 sons. And of course, Abimelech is never really considered one of these sons. He's from a concubine. He's living in Shechem. He's not even living with the family. And I included here a Gideon Bible. It's called Gideon because Gideon went out and evangelized, and there were a couple of businessmen in the late 1800s who stayed in hotels as they went around and did business, and they were very devout Christians, and they wanted to know how they could evangelize, and they came up with this plan to buy Bibles and give them to hotels. And they took as their name the Gideons. And so that's what you'll usually find in your hotel desk is a Gideon Bible. Placed in it, well, it's not a different translation or anything. It's usually King James translation of the Bible, but it will say on the cover, placed by the Gideons. I just thought that was a little interesting side. So anyway, Gideon dies, Israel does evil, and Abimelech, right? Abimelech didn't say that he wouldn't become king. He's the one who's from the concubine. So he hires a bunch of ruffians, and he goes and he kills his 70 brothers. Only one of them escapes, Jotham, and Jotham has his own little section within chapter 9 where he curses Abimelech. And Shechem, which is where his mother was from, makes Abimelech their king. But after 3 years, Shechem realizes, the guy's a jerk. We don't really want him as a king. And they start making plans to get rid of him. But one of the people who's in Shechem gives him a heads up because he's not living in Shechem anymore. And they say, hey, Shechem's going to rise up against you and take you out. And so he raises up his army and he goes back and he raises the city, and a bunch of the people, women and men alike, run to the tower, right? Most of the towns have these tall towers that are made out of very sturdy rock, and they're the safest place in the city. And but he goes out and collects a bunch of brush and tells everybody in his army, hey, all of you, get a bunch of brush and come and put it around this tower. And here, let's burn everybody alive. And that's what he does in Shechem. And then he sows the ground with salt to make sure that the city doesn't come back, which it still does. But and he thinks he's going to do the same in the next town, Thebes. But when he gets there, he gets ready to burn down their tower because a bunch of the women and men ran to its tower to stay safe. But there's a woman looking out from the top of the tower, and she takes one of the stones at the top and she drops it on his head. And so it hits him in the head, but he's not killed. But he says to his servant, run me through with your sword because I don't want to die by the hand of a woman. And so that's how he meets his death, the end of Abimelech, the fake king. In chapters 10 and 11, what a surprise, the cycle repeats itself. We're told about Tola and Jair that judge Israel for a combination of 55 years, but then Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord, and he gives them over to the Ammonites. And so, of course, a judge is going to be raised up. This time it's Jephthah. And Jephthah, we're told, is Gilead's son. Now, Gilead is used as both the name of a person and a land. When you look at that map of Israel, remember on the east side of the Jordan, you have at the bottom Reuben, and then you have Gad. They asked for land before they passed over the Jordan. And right on top of them, you got half the tribe of Manasseh. Well, that half the tribe of Manasseh is what's oftentimes called Gilead, and probably named after the person Gilead. And Gilead has this son, Jephthah, and of course, not by his wife, but by a harlot. And because he's by a harlot, his own sons, who are by his wives, want nothing to do with him because they don't want him to be taking any of their inheritance. So they cast him out, and he becomes a raider, and he gathers about him all of these ruffians, all these bad friends. And they kind of ignore him, except for the fact that they know that he is a tremendous warrior. So they decide, when the Ammonites rise against them, to invite him back. And they say, oh, come on back. He's like, you're the ones who cast me out. And they're like, oh, but you're a great warrior. We're under attack. We need you. And it's like, well, I'm gonna be your judge. I'm gonna rule over you if you have me back. And they're like, oh, anything. So he actually tries to reason with the Ammonites. And you see kind of an interesting look at history here, where the Ammonites say to him, you stole our land, right? You are this people who came out of Egypt. We lived here. You stole our land and we want it back. And Jephthah is like, well, that was 300 years ago. If you really wanted the land back, you should have done something before now. So don't be silly about it, just get out of our way and don't try to rule over us. But the Ammonites are having nothing of it. So there is going to be fighting. So Jephthah makes an unholy vow. He says to God, now God doesn't ask him to do this. God doesn't, this just like is Jephthah's free-flowing thoughts. He says, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes forth from the doors of my house to meet me shall be the Lord's, and I will offer him up as a burnt offering. Now, Yahweh must have just been going, oh my, don't they get it? You don't take other people's lives, right? That's one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill. And especially you don't do it in sacrifices, but this is the whole fear that Yahweh had with them living with these other barbarians. The Canaanites were known for being barbarous people. I think probably most barbarous thing I ever read about them was when they go through these archaeological dig sites, they'll come to like one of those big towers that is built. And at the base of it, it's a Canaanite tower, a Canaanite city. And they will find a little jar at the base of the tower. And it's got a lid on it. And inside is a child who was put in there alive and then allowed to die at the base of this tower, locked in this jar, because that was a way to make sure that the building was blessed by their different Baals and their different foreign gods. Anyway, Jephthah was contaminated by this Canaanite belief in human sacrifice. He makes this vow, and who should come running out of his house when he gets back from defeating the Ammonites but his only daughter, whom he loves. And he tells her, I made this stupid vow. And she's like, should I? They're Israelites. They know God has told them, if you make a vow, you hold to a vow. God didn't want this vow. But now Jephthah's going, oh man, I made this vow to God. And his daughter says, Ryan, you made this vow. Just let me go into the hills for a couple months with my friends and bemoan my virginity, right? I'm never going to be married. I'm never going to have a family, but I'll go with my friends. I'll think about that. Then I'll come back. And she does. And he kills her. And it's not something God wanted or asked for, and it was a great tragedy. So chapter 12, he's defeated the Ammonites, but Jephthah's still he's still judging Israel. And now Ephraim is ticked that Jephthah didn't ask them to fight. Right there, they were ticked when Gideon didn't ask them to fight, but Gideon placated them. Well, Jephthah's a great warrior. And when they come threatening him because he didn't ask them to come and fight with him, he decides that he will just kill them. And he does. And he didn't do it at all like Gideon, right? And there's one last Ephraimite that's left, and he's trying to get back across the Jordan to his own land. And he wants to pass by. And so, right, he's just going to claim that he's not from Ephraim. And so Jephthah and his ruffians say, oh, we'll give you a test. Say Shibboleth. And he doesn't. He says Sibboleth instead. It would be like if you found somebody from Boston and you said, are you from Boston? And they say, no. And you say car. And they go, ka, then you'd know that they were really from Boston, right? So this has actually become a word in the dictionary, a shibboleth. And here's an example of it. This was in New Orleans, a New Orleans shibboleth. A bunch of people came from out of state and they wanted to tear down a statue of Robert E. Lee. And this guy is from New Orleans. And he said, this is the name of one of the streets in New Orleans. And if you can't pronounce it, get out. There was something that was not very nice written right here. And so I just put get out. It has the same meaning, but that's a shibboleth. And now you know where it comes from. It's from the Bible.
That's Tchoupitoulas. That's how you say that.
What, Dewey?
That street is Tchoupitoulas.
You're kidding me. That's how you say that?
Yeah, that's how you say it. That's a very well-known street in New Orleans, Tchoupitoulas.
I would have failed. I would have had to get out of New Orleans. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So chapters 13 and 14, we come to our final major judge, Samson. And Israel has, of course, done evil in God's eyes, and God has given them to the Philistines for 40 years. And so he's going to raise up a judge, and he's going to do that through a man named Manoah and his wife. And we never learn her name. But an angel of the Lord comes to Manoah's wife, and she is barren. And he says to her, "You are going to have a son, but he's going to be a Nazarite from birth." And we talked about Nazarites before. Nazarites are people who are set apart for God. They don't drink alcohol, they don't eat unclean foods, and they don't cut their hair. And so this angel of the Lord tells that to Manoah's wife, but he's not around when she first hears about it. And in fact, when she goes to tell him, she describes this angel of the Lord as something terrifying, that it's this horrendous thing, which is oftentimes when people see the angel of the Lord or angels from the Lord, they're usually described as terrifying. And the first thing the angel will say is, "Be not afraid," right? But we always like to think of them as like these kind of winged, neat, beautiful creatures. And at any rate, when she goes back and tells her husband, Manoah says, "Well, I want to talk to him too." And so he asks God to send back the angel of the Lord that talked to his wife. Well, and so again, it happens just to the wife, but she runs and gets her husband. And he wants to know, should we know anything special about this son that we're supposed to have? And but now the angel of the Lord just appears really as a man to him, and he just tells him the same things, raise him as a Nazarite. And Manoah says, "Well, I want to make an offering to you." And the angel of the Lord says, "Well, make a burnt offering to the Lord." And so he gets a kid goat, and he gets some grain, and to make a cereal offering. And he lights it on fire, and then the angel of the Lord disappears with the smoke. And so Manoah knows, whoa, and his wife, and they both fall on their face. They know they're going to have this son. And so they name him Samson. And Samson grows up, and from all accounts, when you're reading about him, he sounds like a total jerk, really. I mean, God, that's the thing about all these judges, it's not like God has he doesn't make anybody perfect until he makes the Virgin Mary, right? And that's because she's going to bear his son. All these other judges are way more than human. You just are like cringing when you read about them. Samson the same way. So Samson insists on marrying a Philistine woman that he has seen because he thinks she's real pretty and he really wants her. And his family's like, can't you marry somebody within the tribe, right? You're Israelites. We're not supposed to be marrying foreigners. And little did they realize, it says, that God had a plan, that he was ready to free them from the Philistines, and that this was part of his plan. So as Samson's heading down to see this woman that he's fallen in love with, he sees a lion and he kills it, and he tears it apart, it says, right? He's got this tremendous strength. That's his charism that he's given from God. And he actually did that before he went down to visit his lady friend. And as he's on his way back down, he decides to check on this lion carcass, and a bunch of bees have made a nest in it. And so he takes some of the honey and he eats it, and he gives it to his parents. And then he heads back on down to this city of the Philistines so that he can meet up with his bride and marry her. And he's a Riddler. And so they've sent out these 30 guys to party with him. And he says, I'll give you these vestal garments, 30 vestal garments, if you can guess the answer to this little riddle that I'm going to give you. And likewise, you have to give me these garments if you lose. And so he makes up this riddle about this lion and the honey that's in it. And they can't get it, but he's doing his wedding feast. It's going on for days. And they've gone to his wife and said, get him to give us the answer. So she cajoles him to give her the answer. And then she gives it to them. And so on the very last day, they answer his riddle. And he is furious. He knows that they plowed with his heifer, right? Because that's the only way that they could know the answer to this really hard riddle. So he is so mad that he kills 30 men, and he takes their vestal garments and he gives them to the guys he made the bet with. And then he marches off to his father's, screw the whole thing, I'm out of here. Well, so the wedding feast went badly. And when he marches away, the bride's father decides to give her to the best man because he thinks that Samson hates her. So we get to the next part where he goes back to make peace with his bride. He takes a kid goat, right? He's going to get the family back together. But he gets there and his father-in-law says, I gave her to the best man. Why don't you just take her sister, her younger sister? She's fairer anyway. Well, Samson is torqued again. So this time he takes foxtails. He gets 300 foxes. He sets their tails on fire and he sends them into all the fields of the Philistines, and all the crops burn up. And the Philistines are torqued and they ask, who did this? And somebody says, well, is it, Samson, his father-in-law gave his wife away. So they go and they burn up his father-in-law and his wife, which makes Samson even madder. And so then he finds the jawbone of an ass and he kills 1,000 men with it. And then he runs into Judah and finds a cleft in a rock to hide in for a while to let things cool down. Meanwhile, the Philistines, who are very fierce warriors in their own right, go to Judah and they say, you got to give up Samson, right? You got to give this guy up. And otherwise we're going to attack you. So the Judites go to Samson and they tell him, they just lay it on the line, right? If we don't give you up, they're going to attack us. And he's like, well, you're not going to kill me, right? And they're like, no, we're not going to kill you. We're just going to give you to the Philistines so they can kill you. He's like, okay, bind me up. And it's at that point actually that he kills them with the jawbone, because the Judites hand him over, and he kills them. And then chapter 15 ends with, and he judges Israel for 20 years, half of 40, right? So he was one of the great heroes of the tribe of Dan. But chapter 16 is another ending to that same story, right? Samson must have been known for his weakness for women, because he falls now. Chapter 16 opens up with another racy little story. He's with a prostitute in Gaza, and everybody realizes he's there, and so they're going to kill him, and they're going to lay in wait, but then they decide to wait till morning. So at midnight, he actually goes up and picks up the gates of the city. The whole entire gate puts it up on a hill, right? And then he goes to another city and he sees this beautiful Delilah. And so he falls in love with her, and immediately the Philistines go to Delilah and they offer her a bunch of money um, in order to find out where his strength comes from. So he's smitten with her. She asks him, first he says, "Oh, if you get fresh bowstrings, 7 of them, and tie those around my wrists, that will take away my strength." So she ties him up, and then she says, "Samson, the Philistines are on you," because she has all these Philistines in wait for him, and he breaks the bowstrings. And yeah, and you would think at that point, right, he would kill Delilah. But no, she's like, "Oh, I can't believe you lied to me." So then he tells her another story about where his strength comes from. And she tries it again and it fails. And then she pouts some more. And he tells her a third way, "If you tied my hair up in like a bow and a cobweb and you tied it up with a pin, that would take my strength away." And again, she calls in the Philistines and he unleashes his hair and he kills them all. And then she really pouts, "Oh, you really don't love me." And you're like, "Samson, where's your head at? Where's your head at, boy?" So then he really tells her that, "Well, it's my hair. If you cut my hair off, I'm a Nazarite. You cut my hair off, my strength goes." So he falls asleep on her knees. She has somebody cut his hair off. Then she tortures him. Then she calls in the Philistines, and they take him and blind him and put him in a prison and have him walk around in circles grinding mill stone, like an ox would with a millstone grinding the wheat. And but his hair grows back, and they make the mistake of celebrating their victory over him to their god Dagon, right? They're thanking Dagon. And so Samson prays to God and he says, "Just this one last time, just give me the strength one last time to clear my name and yours." And so his hair has been growing back anyway, and they're making sport of him in this arena. And he walks over to the columns, and a great scene in the movie Samson and Delilah. He takes those poles that they're all sitting in a big old platform above, and he takes the columns that are holding up this amphitheater and he pushes them over, and they all die, and he dies with them. And then his people come and get his body because he was one of the great heroes of the tribe of Dan. And so ends the book of Judges, right? Really, what it's doing, it's gluing together Exodus and the time where the kingdom is united. And it's a collection of all these hero liberators and other judges, minor judges who don't have the big heroic stories around them, to give a history. And surely, a lot of it comes from stories that were told of the different tribes of their heroes. Just like we hear about George Washington, who cut down the cherry tree. And then, in history, of course, you learn there was no cherry tree. He didn't chop one down. And so, but God is content with these stories. He let them be there. And what I love is when it helps you understand the New Testament better. So if you go to the letters of St. Paul, right? St. Paul was a Pharisee. He was a Jew's Jew. And in his letter to the Hebrews in chapter 11, verse 32, and that would be on page 1544 if you got this version of the Bible. It says, "And what more shall I say?" This is Paul talking. He's talking about the faith of other heroes in Israel's history. And he says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fires, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Right? If you hadn't read the book of Judges, you wouldn't understand what St. Paul was talking about. But that's what he's talking about, these judges of Israel who helped keep the tribes intact until finally they could be united under David, and until finally Jesus Christ could come from them. And so it is that we get to next week. In the readings for next week, you can finish the book of Judges. It's not in my book of picks because it's not really too edifying. I won't spend much time on it next week. And I'll explain it then. If you read it, you'll see why it's not going to have a lot of huge impact on your understanding of the New Testament. But it is there. It kind of tells the stories of Dan and the tribe of Dan and how they got their land, and some more about Benjamin. And then we'll go to the 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 8, and my picks are down here. And so I'm going to leave this screen up so that you can write those down, because of course I haven't sent you a syllabus. So it's Judges 17 through 21 and 1 Samuel 1 through 8. And my picks: 1 Samuel chapter 1 and chapters 3 and 4. And then it's just a funny way that they've broken up the chapters. And so you start with chapter 6, verse 19, and there's just like a few sentences, and then it'll go into chapter 7 and 8. And you'll see that when you look in your Bible, that's the logical break, is at 6:19, chapter 6, verse 19. And so with that, I will stop the share and I'll stop recording.